What if the Bible is hiding something in plain sight? What if the story you grew up hearing about Noah, the ark, and the flood was only part of the truth? Most of us know the tale. A righteous man builds a massive wooden ship, gathers the animals, and survives a flood that wipes out the earth. It's a story tucked away in Sunday school lessons, illustrated in children's books, softened by smiling animals and rainbows. But this is not that version. In this investigation, we go deeper beyond the surface of Sunday sermons into the darker, more mysterious layers of Scripture. This is not just about salvation, but about selection, about exclusion, about divine judgment not only on mankind, but on certain creatures God Himself chose not to save. Have you ever wondered, why weren't sea creatures mentioned in Noah's manifest? Why did some beings, like the Nephilim, disappear without a trace? And why did God give specific instructions about clean and unclean animals, long before the law of Moses? This isn't just a history lesson. This is a spiritual autopsy, an expose on a divine decision that still echoes today, and it forces a chilling question to the surface.
If Noah's Ark appeared today, would you be allowed on board?
Because this isn't just a story about animals. It's about what God preserves, and what He removes. It's about holiness, corruption, and the eternal standard that separates them. Throughout this journey, we will explore mysteries often overlooked by even the most devoted readers. This is for those who seek more than answers, those who seek a spiritual connection, who wrestle with hard truths and dare to ask,
what has God made clear that we've chosen to forget?
So before you click away, stay with us. What you're about to hear may not only change the way you read Genesis, it may change the way you see yourself.
The trot behind.
The first, fish and sea creatures. Why were they not mentioned? If God commanded Noah to save every living creature, why didn't He mention the fish? Genesis chapter 6 verse 17 offers us a clue.
Behold, I will bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh in which is the breath of life under heaven. Everything that is on the earth shall perish.
The key phrase?
On the earth.
Only animals with the breath of life on dry land were sentenced to die. This small detail, the absence of marine life from the rescue mission, is no oversight. It's a deliberate omission that reveals the deep logic behind God's judgment. The flood wasn't designed to affect every ecosystem indiscriminately. It was tailored for terrestrial corruption, not aquatic life. Fish and sea creatures weren't invited onto the ark because they didn't need to be. The waters that spelled death for land creatures were simply more of the same for those who already lived in them. For those familiar with Jewish cosmology, this fits perfectly. In ancient Hebrew understanding, life was divided into three realms. The waters below are home to marine life, the skies above for the birds, the land beneath our feet for humans and beasts. Only two of these, sky and land, were affected by the flood. Only they held creatures with lungs, breath, and responsibility. God's concern wasn't with preserving everything indiscriminately, but with maintaining the integrity of the creation order He had declared good. The ark wasn't a floating zoo. It was a vessel of moral and spiritual preservation. And that leads us to a deeper point. This seemingly minor omission opens a massive theological window. What God did not save, He did not need to save. There's a sacred principle hidden in plain sight.
What is untouched by judgment is untouched because it remains within its created boundaries.
That's a sobering thought, because we often focus on what was saved, but perhaps we should spend more time asking, what was not? And why? The ark carried forward only what was threatened, only what needed divine intervention to survive. The sea, It simply kept doing what it was always meant to do. Hold life that never rebelled. This subtle design choice teaches us something powerful about God's justice and restraint. He intervenes not to preserve everything, but to preserve what is falling apart, what is in danger of being lost forever.
This concept echoes through the enduring Word Bible commentary and reflects the wisdom found in theology courses that examine the structure of God's original creation order.
Stay with us, because the creatures that did make it on the ark tell a very different story. Clean versus unclean animals. Why 7 pairs? Genesis chapter 7 verse 2 is often read quickly, almost glossed over.
Take with you 7 pairs of every kind of clean animal, a male and its mate, and 1 pair of every kind of unclean animal, a male and its mate.
But pause. Why 7 pairs of clean animals, and only 1 pair of the unclean? Why this divine imbalance? The answer reveals something remarkable. Even before the law of Moses, there was already a divine awareness of clean and unclean. God was already establishing distinctions, not just for ritual purity, but for the health, worship, and identity of his people. At this point in history, there was no Levitical code, no written Torah, and yet, Noah knew. This wasn't guesswork, it was a revelation. This early instruction points to a God who prepares his people ahead of time. Before the flood, before Mount Sinai, before tabernacles and temples, God was already planting seeds of spiritual distinction. Seeds that would one day bloom into the social teachings of the Catholic Church and broader Judeo-Christian ethics. So, why 7 pairs? For 2 reasons. Sacrifice. After the flood, Genesis chapter 8 verse 20 tells us that Noah built an altar and offered burnt offerings from every clean animal and bird. Without multiple pairs, such a sacrifice would have meant extinction. Preservation. Clean animals were used for food, worship, and ritual purity, especially in what would become the daily life of the Israelites. God was ensuring there would be enough to repopulate the earth and sustain covenant life. It's tempting to overlook this detail, but this distinction also had practical health benefits. Later, in Leviticus chapter 11, God would give clear dietary laws, identifying animals that were safe to eat and those that were not. Animals with split hooves that chew the cud, scavengers, predators, or bottom feeders, unclean. Even though in the New Testament, Colossians chapter 2 verse 16 reminds us not to let anyone judge us by what we eat or drink. The spiritual principles remain. The separation of clean and unclean wasn't just dietary. It was symbolic. It reminded Israel that they were a people set apart, chosen for a holy purpose. Fork and knife with plate. You might never have thought of your dinner plate as a theology lesson. But in Noah's day, it was. Could diet itself be part of God's strategy of salvation? Absolutely. The distinction taught discipline, it taught awareness, and it pointed to a God who cares not just about what we believe, but how we live. Today, while we no longer follow those exact food laws, they still echo through traditions like perpetual help novena, through spiritual reading, and in how many Christian Reformed churches and Grace Christian church communities emphasize living a life of mindful holiness. In a world flooded with excess and compromise, Noah's obedience stands as a quiet challenge to us.
Would we recognize what is clean if no one told us?
His story calls us not just to believe, but to discern, to sacrifice, and to live distinctly, even when no one else does. Nephilim, the beings God excluded from Noah's Ark. The story you're about to hear is one most churches avoid.
Genesis chapter 6 verse 14. the sons of God saw that the daughters of humans were beautiful, and they married any of them they chose. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went to the daughters of humans and had children by them.
Let that sink in. The Bible isn't talking about giants from fairy tales. It's talking about a hybrid race, the Nephilim, born from the union between fallen angels and human women. They weren't just tall, they were unnatural, unholy, a cosmic violation of creation's boundaries. This is why they were not allowed on the ark. God didn't just wipe out a sinful generation. He purged the earth of something far more sinister, a spiritual infection, a genetic rebellion, a counterfeit creation. While Genesis gives us a brief glimpse, books like Enoch and Jubilees paint the fuller, terrifying picture. These fallen angels, called Watchers, descended from heaven and mated with women, teaching their offspring sorcery, warfare, and destruction. The Nephilim became the embodiment of chaos, devouring the earth, corrupting mankind, and even turning against one another. But here's the deeper horror. Their purpose wasn't random. These unions were part of Satan's strategy, a direct attack on the promised seed of Genesis chapter 3 verse 15. God had declared that one day, the seed of the woman would crush the serpent's head. Satan's response? Pollute the entire bloodline of humanity.
This wasn't just genetic defiance. It was an attempt at spiritual abortion, to erase the line from which the Messiah would come.
That's why Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord. Genesis chapter 6 verse 9 calls him a righteous man, blameless in his generations. His family's lineage was still pure, untouched by the angelic corruption that had saturated the earth. So God drew a line. The Nephilim would not survive. They were not permitted on the ark. They were not part of his covenant. Only what was born of his design would enter. Everything else, erased. Here's the terrifying truth. The fear of the Nephilim is not in their height, but in their intention. They represent every attempt to rewrite what God has made sacred. They are a shadow of what happens when the holy is mixed with the profane, when divine boundaries are crossed, and when man allies with darkness to reshape his destiny. And it didn't end at the flood. Numbers chapter 13 verse 33 reports that even after the flood, the descendants of Anak, the Nephilim, were still present.
We saw the Nephilim there, and we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes.
How? Perhaps the bloodline continued through one of Noah's daughters-in-law. Perhaps fallen angels returned. Either way, they show up again, known later as the Rephaim, the Zamzummim, the Anakim, and they stand in opposition to God's people throughout the Old Testament. Commentary from the Enduring Word Bible Commentary describes them as spiritual strongholds manifested in flesh, a symbol of demonic resistance against God's plan of redemption. And they still represent a threat today, not in flesh, but in form, in ideologies, in compromises, in anything that dares to mix light with darkness. What God excluded from the ark, he is still excluded from the kingdom. This section of the story isn't just scary, it's sacred, because it reminds us that salvation is not for those who imitate God's creation, but for those who remain within it. And that begs the question, are there Nephilim among us now? Not in size, but in spirit? After the flood, did the Nephilim survive? When the flood came, it wiped out almost everything. The sinful, the rebellious, the corrupted, but not everything.
We saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. Numbers chapter 13 verse 33.
Wait, what? The Nephilim were supposed to be gone, erased, buried beneath the wrath of God in a flood that covered the mountains. So, how did the descendants of Anak, giants, show up hundreds of years later in the Promised Land? Scholars and theologians, both in Enduring Word Bible Commentary and other theology courses, suggest two possible explanations. Neither is comforting. The fallen angels returned. Some believe the same class of fallen angels, those who committed the original rebellion, descended again. Perhaps not all of them were imprisoned after the flood, as Jude chapter 6 and 2 Peter chapter 2 verse 4 suggest. They may have once again taken human wives, once again corrupted God's creation, and once again created beings not of earth, not of heaven, but somewhere terrifyingly in between. The corrupted bloodline survived. Another chilling theory? That the Nephilim never really disappeared at all. They may have passed on their genetic corruption through the wives of Noah's sons, contaminating the post-flood generations. Remember, Genesis tells us Noah was blameless in his generation, but it says nothing about his daughters-in-law. That quiet omission might be one of the most disturbing silences in the entire Bible. Fast forward to Israel's entry into Canaan. They encounter more than hostile tribes. They encounter giants, the Rephaim, the Zamzummim, the Emim, the Anakim. These aren't just tall people. They are described as terrifying, unnatural, and enemies of God's covenant people. Why did God command Israel to destroy certain groups? Men, women, and children? Because these weren't just military battles. They were purges of spiritual corruption. This wasn't a conquest, it was cleansing. God had given the land to his people, but it had been infected by something ancient, something that began before the flood and tried to rise again. These stories aren't just about battles. They are short Christian stories with moral lessons, and one moral stands above the rest. God takes defilement seriously. The Canaanite giants weren't just physical enemies. They were spiritual infestations. And that's the real fear, isn't it? That's what God once destroyed might find a way back in. What if the story of the Nephilim isn't just a tale of ancient horrors, but a warning? A warning about what happens when God's people slowly begin accepting what he once rejected. It starts small, a compromise here, a tolerance there, an open-minded discussion about what's already been called unholy. And before you know it, the giants are back, not in physical form, but in spirit. Giant ideologies, giant moral confusion, giant compromises that blur the line between sacred and profane. In the land God promised, purity mattered, not just to maintain order, but to prepare a holy nation, set apart for his glory. That's why Israel couldn't just coexist with the Nephilim. They had to destroy them. Anything less was disobedience. Today, many churches are tempted to do the opposite, to coexist with corruption, to blend what is holy with what is broken, to rationalize what God once called unclean. But the truth remains. What God once wiped out with a flood, he will not tolerate it in his kingdom. The story of the Nephilim is more than just one of the most significant Bible stories. It's a mirror. Ask yourself, are there Nephilim in your life not in body, but in belief? Because if they're back, they didn't come through the front door. They crept in through the cracks in our convictions. The Ark, a symbol of exclusion. The Ark wasn't just a boat. It was a line, a threshold, a spiritual filter through which only the uncorrupted could pass. To many, Noah's Ark is a tale of survival, a sweet, short Christian story with a moral lesson for Sunday school. But in reality, it is one of the most sobering and terrifying moments in all of Scripture. Because it isn't just a story of who was saved, it's a story of what and who was left out. The ark was sacred space. Genesis shows us that God commanded Noah to build the ark according to specific divine measurements. It was to be covered in pitch and sealed completely. Inside would be pairs of every clean animal. Outside, a storm of judgment. But why such strict boundaries? Because the ark was more than a vessel. It was a sacred space, a reset chamber for a new world, unpolluted by the defilements that brought about the flood.
The ark was holy ground that floated.
Nothing impure was allowed inside, not because God hated those beings, but because they were no longer redeemable. The Nephilim weren't merely sinners. They were spiritual hybrids, corruptions of creation itself. They didn't belong to heaven, nor earth. And so, when the door of the ark was shut, it wasn't merely a piece of wood closing. It was God's judgment, sealing the fate of everything unclean. God's love is not sentimental.
We ask, doesn't God love all his creation?
Absolutely. But the deeper question is this:
what is still in a state that can be purified and restored?
There is a chilling principle hidden in this story, one that echoes in the Catholic social justice teachings and the social teachings of the Catholic Church. Love does not eliminate consequences. What cannot be sanctified must be separated. The ark was God's surgical scalpel, cutting out the infection so that life could flourish again. Obedience was the only ticket. You might think the criteria to enter the ark were religious affiliation or ritual purity. But it wasn't. Noah wasn't saved because he followed a religion. He was saved because he walked with God and obeyed without hesitation.
Faith didn't get him a lecture. It got him a blueprint.
This is what the Faith Christian Center, Marked Men for Christ, and even ministries like Grace Christian Church often emphasize. Obedience is not optional. It is the vessel of survival. That's why, in this spiritual metaphor, getting on the ark wasn't about being a good person or generally moral. It was about alignment with God's holiness.
The ark wasn't built for comfort. It was built for obedience. Just as Jesus said, "Not everyone who says to me, 'Lord, Lord,' will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only the one who does the will of my Father." Matthew chapter 7 verse 21.
In today's world, many believe he gets us, and he does, but the question the ark forces us to face is,
do we still reflect him enough to be brought aboard his plan?
this is not just ancient history. The same God who closed the door to the ark will one day close the door again. But this time, it won't be a flood. It will be fire. 2 Peter chapter 3 verse 7. And again, the question won't be,
do you attend church? Or, do you believe in God?
the question will be,
Did you walk with me? Were you set apart? Or did you blend in with a corrupted world?
this isn't just about animals or ancient judgment. It's about you. And whether your heart, your lifestyle, your faith, can withstand the test of divine holiness. The ark was not a rescue boat for the religious. It was a holy vessel for the obedient. And only those who lived by that obedience, those who bore spiritual fruit, as reinforced by Catholic social teachings and spiritual reading traditions, were allowed to enter. So, if the ark came today, would you be invited aboard? Or would the door close while you stood just outside? Days of Noah equals days of now, when materialism kills the soul.
Just as it was in the days of Noah, so also will it be in the days of the Son of Man. Luke chapter 17 verse 26.
We are not just reading prophecy. We are living it. Jesus didn't say the world would be full of obvious wickedness before his return. He didn't warn about plagues or wars in this passage. He didn't talk about demons. NEPHILIM, or political corruption. What did he warn about? People eating, drinking, marrying, buying, selling, building, planting. Ordinary things, good things, necessary things. But something was missing. The sin beneath the surface. Jesus wasn't condemning the actions. He was exposing the condition of the heart. It wasn't what they were doing that was dangerous. It was what they were ignoring. In Noah's time, and in Lot's time, people were so caught up in the everyday that they failed to see the eternal. They were drowning not in water, but in distraction, and by the time the door closed, it was too late.
The tragedy isn't that you sinned. The tragedy is that you stopped feeling anything when you sinned.
Materialism, the silent assassin. We call it progress. We call it success. We even call it God's blessing. But sometimes, it's a golden noose. In today's Western culture, materialism has evolved into something deeper. It's not just about money anymore. It's about identity, about value, about the purpose. You are what you drive. You are how you dress. You are what you can afford to post on social media. And the church is not immune. Many believers now attend services in churches more aligned with Victory Christian Fellowship or Faith Christian Center aesthetics, where sermons become self-help talks and worship becomes performance. And in the silence, souls fall asleep. The days of Noah were days of numbness. When Jesus likened our generation to Noah's, he wasn't just giving a timeline. He was giving a diagnosis. People back then weren't necessarily evil. They were numb. Their consciences were dulled. Their priorities flipped. Their sense of urgency erased. Materialism is not a sin of action. It's a sin of inattention. It blinds you to what matters. You still go to church, but you don't tremble. You still pray, but your heart doesn't break. You still believe in Jesus, but you don't long for him. That's how judgment sneaks up. Not with a roar, but with a whisper. Are we sleeping through a storm? Imagine this. You're living a good life. You're not killing anyone. You're not stealing. You're doing fine. But the door is closing. And when the ark of grace sails by again, will you be so wrapped in Netflix, portfolios, real estate, and renovations that you miss the knock? Will you recognize the call of God, or will it sound like background noise? This is where the spiritual connection taught in theology courses, the Grace Christian Church, and even through spiritual reading becomes essential. Because you will not be saved by what you possess. You will be saved by who you pursue. The wake-up call of Jesus. Jesus said the people in Noah's day were caught unaware until the flood swept them away. The same thing happened in Sodom. Destruction arrived after the last deal was made. The last drink poured. The last building built. The difference wasn't knowledge, it was discernment. They didn't feel the shift. They didn't sense the storm. They didn't notice the silence before judgment. And many of us are just like them.
You're not called to escape the world, but you are called to remain uncorrupted by it.
This is why we need reminders like those found in Catholic social teachings, or in the symbolism of the perpetual help novena, which emphasizes returning to God in humility and clarity. Before the door closes, again. This generation is not the first to face judgment, but it might be the most distracted. That's why the enemy doesn't need to destroy you. He only needs to keep you entertained. He only needs to keep you comfortable enough, numb enough, busy enough, until it's too late. So ask yourself, are you building barns, or building an altar? Are you chasing the blessing, or chasing the blesser? Because just like in Noah's day, the ark is being built, the countdown has begun, and the door will close. Will you be awake when it does? Jesus in Hades, victory proclaimed to the lost. 1 1 Peter chapter 3 verses 18 to 20 tells a story most churches dare not preach. It speaks of a Jesus we don't often imagine. Not nailed to a cross, not seated on a throne, but walking boldly through the realm of the dead.
He was put to death in the body but made alive in the spirit. And in that spirit, he went and preached to the spirits in prison.
Who were these spirits? The Bible says they were disobedient in the days of Noah. They weren't just lost souls. They were fallen angels, corrupted beings, the rebellious ones who crossed divine boundaries. These were not people who simply made mistakes. They were beings who waged war against God's plan. Beings who tried to corrupt humanity's bloodline through the NEPHILIM, to stop the Messiah from ever being born. They were cast down, chained in darkness, forgotten by history, feared in ancient memory, but not forgotten by God.
This wasn't a rescue mission. This was a revelation mission. Jesus didn't enter Hades to bargain. He came to proclaim victory.
The silence between the cross and the resurrection. For 3 days, the earth held its breath. Jesus had died. He had bled. He had given up his spirit. He was far from finished. In the unseen realm, beneath the surface of reality, he descended. Not as a victim, but as a king.
This is where theology meets terror. For the enemies of God, this was the day they knew they had lost.
The same Jesus who cried out, "It is finished," now stood face to face with the origin of evil. Every knee shall bow, even in the pit. Philippians chapter 2 verse 10 declares,
At the name of Jesus every knee should bow, in heaven, on earth, and under the earth.
there is no depth he has not reached, no dominion where his name does not reign, no darkness that can hide from his light. And so, in the deepest chambers of judgment, where the watchers were chained, where the spiritual traitors of Genesis chapter 6 were held in torment, Jesus appeared, not to negotiate, not to offer second chances, but to proclaim his undisputed lordship. Jesus in Hades was not powerless, he was unleashed. John chapter 10 verses 17 to 18 says,
No one takes my life from me. I lay it down of my own accord. I have the authority to lay it down and the authority to take it up again.
He went to Hades on purpose, not as a soul seeking direction, but as the commander of all creation. He declared that the blood had been shed, the curse was broken, the cross had crushed the serpent's head. The imprisoned spirits heard the verdict that had echoed from Golgotha, now resonating even through the halls of the damned.
Even in the place humanity fears most, Christ's voice was not silent.
This moment is celebrated not only by saints, but deeply contemplated by those studying significant Bible stories, within the Enduring Word Bible commentary, and through deep spiritual reading. It reminds us that the victory of Christ was not symbolic, it was cosmic. What this means for you and me. It means no realm is off limits to Jesus. Not your guilt, not your shame, not the darkest part of your past, not the loved one you lost. He didn't just preach in the synagogue. He didn't just walk on water. He walked into the grave and kept walking, until every demon, every fallen angel, every force of hell knew his name. The final echo. What Jesus did in Hades was not random. It was the culmination of what began in the Garden of Eden, when Satan tried to infect the bloodline of man. But God had a plan. The flood was a judgment. The ark was mercy. The cross was payment. And this moment in Hades, it was a declaration. He didn't whisper, he thundered. And because he descended into the lowest place, you can be confident he'll lift you to the highest. You may feel like you're too far gone. You may feel like you're in a prison of your own. But he's been there. And when Jesus shows up, even the gates of hell cannot remain closed. We often ask the wrong question. Instead of, "Do I believe in God?" maybe today, you should ask,
If Noah's Ark appeared again, would I be allowed on board?
you don't need to be perfect. You need the truth. You don't need to understand everything. You need to surrender. The ark wasn't built for the smartest. It was built for the repentant. The flood didn't come because people were confused. It came because they were comfortable. Too comfortable in their rebellion. Distracted by their routines. Too numb to recognize the voice of God. And if you feel something stirring in you today, that's not a coincidence. That's a knock. A divine whisper that says, "Get ready. Come in before it's too late." So pray this, not with fear, but with faith.
Lord, don't let me be one of the creatures left outside the ark. Wash me clean with your blood, so that when that day comes, I will be found within.
In a world flooded by noise, temptation, and false security, the story of Noah's Ark is not just ancient history. It's a mirror. It reminds us that not everything is meant to be saved, only what is surrendered. We live in a time much like Noah's, prosperous, busy, distracted, and dangerously numb. But God's call remains. Enter the ark. Choose repentance over resistance, obedience over opinion. Your age, your past, your doubts, they don't disqualify you. What matters is where you stand when the door begins to close. Comment: I choose to be inside the ark. Red Heart, share this video. Someone you love may still be standing in the rain.